My name is LeeAnn Dreadfulwater, and I am a Cherokee Nation citizen. I work for the Cherokee Film Commission, and my job with that is to do research, historical and cultural research. And how this sort of came about was I have been trail riding out in what is now known as the Cherokee Wildlife Management Area for probably about 30 years. And during that time, I got really interested in the things that I was seeing out there as we trail ride. There would be a cistern over here, somebody's well. There would be maybe a cellar, just a remnant of something that looked interesting. And I really wanted to know, what was that? Who did it belong to? Where did it come from, and where did they go? And so I started sort of looking into that, and about that same time I was starting to come on with Cherokee Nation film, and we have a little show that some of you might have watched a time or two called OCO Voices of the Cherokee People. And probably, I think it was probably 5 or 6 years ago, they said, why don't you take us out there and tell us a story about what you see when you ride out here, and then we're going to talk to some other people who are, part of the families that were removed. And so we did that. I managed to get an entire film team lost and stuck on Black Hollow Road. Some of you know where that is. But it was all good. In the end, we ended up making a pretty nice little short video about this same story that I'm going to tell you about. And so you can go onto our website, which is oco.tv, and you can look for the Camp Gruber story, and you'll be able to watch it from there. So what I want to start with, I'm telling you basically this is, why should I care? And you can see that we're riding across the bridge up here, and that is some of you call it the Greenleaf Bridge. I've heard it called the old WPA Bridge. It was built in 1938. And I'm going to kind of wing some of this today because I had a terrible computer crash right this morning as I was working on this PowerPoint. So some of it we're just going to wing our way through. And some of it made it, but okay. So the Cookson Hills. For anybody that's not really familiar with them, they are a massive area that's part of the Ozark foothills. They sort of are in a kind of almost a triangle shape between Tahlequah, Stillwell, and Sallisaw. And there's a lot of countryside in between. It is rugged. It is very dense forest. There's all kinds of woods and animals, and you name it. It is a very, I think, probably almost inhospitable place to live. However, when Cherokees got here, the first Cherokees that we know of that started moving into the area was maybe in the 1820s with some of the old settlers. And then, of course, the immigrants came a little bit later on. And many of them began settling out there. We had many families like the Ballards, the Sanderses, quite a number of others there were Dazzlers, Zigglers, Gurdies, okay. And just a number of names, Pettits, all kinds of Cherokee names that you would recognize and that are probably part of a lot of your families, to be honest. So they start settling out there and they start creating these towns that are coming up, such as Garfield, Yellowhammer. These are communities that are, Greenleaf, Houto, I think is how you pronounce it. Just a number of places that are sort of scattered through this area. And these are places that had schools. These are places that had, in some cases, a post office, a courthouse. Cherokee Nation used to be divided into 9 districts prior to statehood, and the Illinois district was one of them. Cookson Hills sort of overlaps into Illinois district and Tahlequah district and a couple of those old districts, but the Illinois courthouse for the Cherokee Nation, which was one of the 9 district courthouses, was located in what is now part of Camp Gruber. So the story that I think people are not familiar with, how many of you, if I say Camp Gruber, you know what I'm talking about? Okay, most people do. All right. Well, how many people in here too have some kind of connection with maybe a family member or somebody that lived out there? Okay, excellent. I'm so glad you all are here. I really am. So I think the thing that we need to understand is how much was actually there. And so there are tons of these little self-sufficient farms. This is not great land to, you're not going to grow great crops here, but it's self-sufficient. People are out here, they're in a place on up into the 1940s where, there's no electricity, there's no running water. They maybe have a patch of corn, they have maybe some cattle, to get meat, butter, milk, hogs to butcher, and a few other crops, chickens, whatever you need to be able to subsist with. If you needed something else, you probably went into brags. Tahlequah would have been a little bit far. Some people, depending on where they were, did do that. But these are people who are mostly very self-sufficient, and you'll see the same names over again. People were marrying their neighbors, as people did back in the day. You didn't have a big dating pool to go through, so lots and lots of times you see that there was a Ballard that married a Pettit, that married a Dazzler, and it just kind of goes on like that. And so we kind of go through this time period, and we get up to, let me see if this is still here. I just wanted to show you some photos of what was here prior to Camp Gruber. And anybody recognize any family members up there? Okay, who do you see?
My dad and his 2 brothers and 2 sisters in the Yellowhammer school pictures.
Excellent, okay. Now this is, there were so many schools out here, and Yellowhammer School was one of them that was open for years and years. And you can see there's a pretty good sized student body there.
That was about 1920.
Okay, about 1920. And so one of the things that the schoolhouses were often used for, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, was they were used in the wintertime for your churches as well. Most of the time, church is held outside. There's not necessarily a formal church building there, but they would be used oftentimes as kind of double duty for things. And so you've got a ton of schools that are out there. And also we've got images of some of the families, some of the homes that were here, and there are the kids that are up there on the horse. At that house, which I think this was the White Marsh house, I think, but before that I think it was Didy Redfern, and there is a cellar, a huge, immense cement cellar out there off of where White Oak Road and Cedar Bluff Road come together. And so we'd ride past that, and it was just amazing to me when I finally was able to find out, like, that's who that cellar belonged to, and then to come across a picture of, this is the place that it was. It's just amazing to me. There's nothing left but the cellar now, unfortunately. Okay. So I was going to talk a little bit about the Dawes era and what had kind of happened there. So the state of Oklahoma comes in, we start doing allotment. How many of you had a family allotment anywhere? Okay, a lot of people. How many of you had one that was inside of what's now Camp Gruber or, okay, I see some hands. Yeah, and so many Cherokees were living on their allotments out there, and this is the land that the government had basically deigned to give these families after they had just, had lived there in communal. The land was owned communally when it was Cherokee Nation, and so when it is allotted, then everyone sort of becomes a citizen of the state of Oklahoma. They've got to pay taxes in some cases. A lot of the land was restricted though, because there were a lot of full-blood and half or better people that were living out there. And so their land was restricted, and that probably helped some of them to not lose their land. Other people, sometimes by the time that what we're going to talk about happened, had lost their land to tax sales. Really unfortunate. I mean, this is a pretty sad story all the way around. So when these allotments come in, you know, the families sort of make do. There is surplus land that's turned around and it's given to, in some cases, to non-Indian people that come in. And so the way that things are looking out there is starting to change a little bit, but it still retains the same kind of rugged flavor that it's been. And so things kind of cook along until you know, we've built up all of these communities. We've got some pretty neat things that are happening that, like I said, the WPA is starting to come along, and it's actually built a big bridge over Greenleaf Creek. And so before that, if I'm not mistaken, there was sort of a swinging footbridge over that, and that's how kids got to school, and that's how people got to the store, if you can imagine, you know, doing that. And otherwise, there are all kinds of, if I've got the right pictures here, I'll show you, there are all kinds of creeks and places that you had to ford if you were either on foot, on horseback, or with your wagon. And if you can imagine what that would have been like and how long it would have taken you to get someplace, and just the, you know, the way that life could be very hard. Okay, here's the bridge that I was talking about. And so as you ride by the top of it, there is one of the pylons on the bridge at the top says clear as day, WPA 1938. So that gives us kind of an anchor point for when some of this is going on. And I imagine that that was probably a pretty big deal to the families that were out there. You know, suddenly you've got some better roads, you can get across this was the biggest creek that was out there. You know, and you can actually get from here to there without getting your feet wet, imagine. So the sad thing is they didn't get to enjoy this for very long, because just a couple of years later, we had some other things happen. War is declared. What happened at this time? December 7th? Okay, Pearl Harbor, yeah. And so the result of that is then, you know, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declares war. And he is very adamant about having prepared troops. So we have all of these training encampments, cantonments, that are sort of springing up. And they start looking around, where can we do something that is sort of in this Midwest area? Well, there had been a plan shortly before this happened. The state of Oklahoma was going to dam up Greenleaf Creek and make Greenleaf Lake, and they were starting to make all of these pretty lodges, these pretty stone lodges, and you can still see some of them out there at Greenleaf State Park. These were going to be, you know, a magnificent playground. They were advertising it in the TVs, or newspapers at the time, and letting them know, you know, you're going to be able to come out here. It is going to be, you know, just a place for the ages. Everyone is going to want to come out here and recreate, and we're going to have this beautiful lake and so forth. Well, actually, the government thought that sounded like a dandy place to put in a military encampment. And so they start condemning and taking over the land. So one of the biggest cabins up there at Greenleaf State Park ends up becoming, a little bit later on, becomes the officers' camp. And it's the housing for the officers at Camp Gruber. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And so they all start coming in kind of bit by bit, and ultimately 66,000 acres is condemned and taken over for the war effort. That's a lot. It's a huge amount of what is now the Cookson Hills. And And I have a funny story about the name Cookson and where that came from. So I think what we see a lot is that it was named after the Cookson family. Yeah, it was. But how did they get that name? And so what I have come across and thought was very interesting and kind of fun was that, there was a young man, I believe his name was Joseph, and so Joe was coming across, he was 5 years old, he's coming across the Atlantic with his mother on a ship to the US, and it's probably about 1805, something like that. He comes over, and on the way there, his mother is the cook on the ship. And you can probably guess what happens from there. They start saying, oh, that's Joe, the cook's son. He becomes Joe Cookson. And he sort of starts this entire Cookson family. So that's the story, and that is straight from records from a man that grew up out there and had left us some pretty good recordings of things that he encountered. His name was William Ballard, and his interviews with WPA and some other records that he left are pretty interesting. He was a law enforcement guy. So getting back to what's happening with this land being condemned, people are absolutely devastated. They are being sort of sold out, and they're not really getting compensated for it. Most of the families are given about 45 days to move out. It's the springtime, the crops are not in yet. And we just talked about these are subsistence farms. If you don't have crops, you're not going to survive the winter. And plus they're being moved away to someplace else, and they're not allowed to take these crops with them. So, this is something that's happening. They're trying to move everything that they can, as best they can, out of these homes that we were showing you a minute ago. And they're having to leave behind precious things like family photos and maybe an organ or dishes or something else that they just couldn't get out of there. And they're moving them by horse and wagon for the most part. And that takes a long time, and it doesn't hold very much. So unfortunately, many, many things are just simply left standing out there. Sometimes there were people who, we have records of people that said, well, what we did was we had our son sneak back in there and collect what crops he could. And they would do things like that. This is a pretty desperate time. And, I think they were resourceful. So all of these things are kind of happening at once, and Camp Gruber is this overnight city that springs up in place of this. And it goes in primarily over on, it straddles Cherokee and Muskogee County. And so mostly on what is the Muskogee County side, you end up with a lot of the military barracks, and all of that, and they are using the side over, which is now Cherokee Wildlife. A lot of that is used for drills and things in that rugged countryside. They're doing water drills, they're doing running tanks through there, they're dropping bombs on it. So I have ridden through there and actually seen unexploded ordnance, and had to talk somebody I was with out of picking it up and taking it with us. That's a big no-no, by the way. If you see unexploded ordnance out there, you need to go report it. But there also are craters left in certain places out there. This is where some of these practice drills were. It's left a crater in the ground where a big ordnance was dropped. Also, a lot of the homes, you wonder why there's nothing still standing out there. They were used for target practice. And after the military had cleaned out what they could out of these homes, they just basically let the troops go have at it on them, which is just sort of insult to injury. The interesting thing that I ran across too was that some of the soldiers who were stationed there at Gruber had enlisted and had been former residents of this area. One guy was, I think his last name was Prey. They quoted him in the newspaper and he said, you know, that over there, that was just, you know, that was our cotton field. And now it's got tanks on it. And so, you know, he's just looking and saying, you know, this just sort of happened overnight, and it really did. Gruber was a city unto itself. It housed thousands and thousands and thousands of troops in many, many barracks. It was a place that held all kinds of things for the troops so that they could be self-sufficient. They put in 5 theaters, and they were showing first-run movies, sometimes before the other theaters out in the world got these movies. They had USO-type entertainment that they were getting. There were hostesses that were coming over from Muskogee who would come over and sort of put on a dance or something for them. They had various types of entertainment that came through. They had a big stadium that was built, and the most famous boxer of the era, Joe Louis, came in and put on an exhibition fight there. So it's a big deal. And they are running out of places to put people just about. It's having a huge impact on the economy of Muskogee. And because this is where people go to, you know, if they're leaving the base, then they're going to recreate, they're going over there. You see lots of marriages during this time, and the troops were, you know, this is baby boom time, kind of the start of it. And so you start seeing these things happening. It's impacting everything. One of the reasons that this area was a good spot for this was that the railroad had gone through and they could take it through Bragg's. And so there is a lot that is coming through, supplies and other things that are there for the troops and that can be just offloaded from Bragg's from the train. So that was another kind of a point that made this a good place for this. Oh, and President Roosevelt did come out and review the troops in 1943, and it was kind of a hush-hush deal. Nobody was supposed to know about it. For his safety, he comes in and, you know, comes and reviews them. He's reviewing the 88th Infantry. The Rainbow Division was also out there. There were several, what you would say, fairly well-known troops and military groups that were trained at Camp Gruber. So you start seeing things like that. He comes out and wants to see what this is. He wrote back and said he was really pleased and that they served him a great meal. So, you know, that was just something that was another interesting thing, to have a president, sitting president, come through and want to see what's going on and review the troops. I know they must have been incredibly proud to have him there. And so in the meantime, let me see if I can get this to catch up. So we've lost all of these communities over here to Camp Gruber, and something that we haven't really talked about was when you have people that live somewhere for 50, 60 years, and you have those kinds of settlements that are there, some people longer than that, you are going to have some deaths. And most people had a cemetery, either on their property or nearby. And some of these cemeteries ended up with names after their community, McCracken or Yellowhammer, Greenleaf, different ones. And so what happens is, you know, all of these little cemeteries, the folks that are being removed said, we want our people to go, you can't just leave our families here. We don't want to leave our families. So the military goes and has this grand plan, and they go into 19, maybe 20 cemeteries, and they go in and remove, again, with horse and wagon, remove them out to what is the present day Greenleaf Cemetery. It's out next to Hendricks Cemetery on Highway 62, just as you're going west out of Tahlequah. And so there are probably countless people that didn't get moved. I'm also suspicious about how good of a job they actually did digging up bodies and matching them up with whatever the headstones said. There are a lot of these headstones that are out at Greenleaf now that are actually in Cherokee syllabary. And so I had a couple of friends who are Cherokee speakers and read and write in syllabary to help with some of that, and was able to translate a few of them. I know one of them was a Sawney family that's out there. And so, it would be a great thing to have all of those tombstones that are out there that are in Cherokee syllabary to be translated, because a lot of people don't know what they're walking by and what they're seeing out there. And some of them are in very faint sandstone. They just are sort of carved in there. Others are, the very nice monuments. And I believe the oldest grave that got moved allegedly was a man that was born in around 1728. And he lived to be about 100 or 101. So that is a cemetery that started going in out there in this area in the 1820s, if you can imagine that. So they're moving people going back from 100 years, which I think is just an incredible thing to think about. So there's also the deal with, what happens, what are we going to get for our land? And the government said, oh, we'll compensate you for it. But unfortunately, most of the families got little or nothing. Some people got as little as $25 for their entire farm. One that I read about got more like $900, and then they kind of went to court over it and got awarded just a smidge more, and then the lawyers took half of it. So there were just lots of sort of skullduggery and things that were not right that are going on with this. We had a principal chief at the time whose name was J.B. Milam, excuse me, and Chief Milam was very concerned about what was happening to the Cherokees out there, and he thought maybe he could help. He tried to get some of them to come in, and some of the families, he wanted them to actually file sort of almost like a class action lawsuit. And you can't blame them. Most of these folks are a little suspicious of the government, and what else are they going to take from me? Most of them didn't want to take him up on that. A few did. He tried to continue to work through it, and he did that for the rest of his life. He died about 10 years after he started all of this, and it still wasn't completed. There still were people that had never gotten a dime. So, to me, this is just an incredibly sad story to think about what has happened to these folks. And did I mention that some of them moved over to an area that in the 1950s became Lake Tenkiller? They get moved again. Anybody in here that's connected with one of those families? Yeah. So how did you do it? How did you manage?
It wasn't easy.
No, I can't imagine. Your heart has to be broken 3 times over for that. So it's just something that I think most people kind of know that this place exists out there, but don't really know how it came about, and are not really maybe clear on how did we get this place. The wildlife management area, and somebody asked me a little bit ago, well, why wasn't it just given back to the Cherokees? Why didn't they just give them back that land? Well, they were keeping half of it which is still to this day Camp Gruber. I'll get to that in a minute. But the side that's on Cherokee County, the state had control of it by now, and they are sort of hemming and hawing around, and they're coming up with one excuse after another about why it can't go back to its original owners. And lo and behold, about the 1970s, they have another great idea. They are starting to make wildlife management game refuges all over the state of Oklahoma. And they decide to turn what is the east side of Camp Gruber, the Cherokee County side, gets turned into Cherokee Wildlife Management Area. And so, you know, to this day, you can go out there, there is a game management half and there's a public hunting half, which is, I think, the part that's down to the south. There are maps of all of these different roads and things out here, and they're named a lot of times after the families that used to live there. There's Benj Road, there's Yellowhammer Road, there are all kinds, Carlisle's, all kinds of places that were roads to these homes that we're talking about, that they're still out there. If you have a four-wheel drive, you might be able to get to some of them. I go there on horseback, it works. But there are, you know, very few things left to show you where some of these places are. You might run across some place that has some rose bushes left over, or japonica, or a lot of times you'll see daffodils that are just sort of blooming in the springtime, and this is not a place where they naturally should occur. And you know that's where there was a home. There are miles and miles of rock fence out there. And that was another thing that was really interesting, to find out who belonged to some of these rock fences. Let's see, we talked about Chief Milam. And okay, I'm trying to think of which thing to tell you first here. Basically, after Camp Gruber is decommissioned, it goes dormant for a while, and a lot of you may know of even homes and things that are made from buildings that were part of the camp out there, part of the barracks, and some of the other buildings that were scrapped for lumber and supplies and brought into Tahlequah and Braggs and other places. My great-grandfather had built a cabin out on the Illinois River, and he went out there and got some of the lumber, some of the windows that were in our little place had come out of the barracks at Camp Gruber. That was a very, very common thing. So a lot of these buildings and things, they're sort of slowly kind of disappearing. And then we get into the 1950s, and we have the Korean War. And there is kind of a big hue and cry over, well, let's reopen Gruber for the Korean War effort. And I think they, at that point, decided they just didn't have the means to rebuild it. It had already been sort of scrapped too much, and was going to be too much trouble to do that. So it almost happened over again. So Camp Gruber remained decommissioned for quite a few years, and then in the late 70s, early 80s, it became a Homeland Security place. So it is, to this day, is a Homeland Security training facility. They train all kinds of National Guards out there, all kinds of military, lots and lots of law enforcement goes out there for training. They have some mock cities so that, you know, they can learn how to be silent, signal to each other, you know, work appropriately in some of these dangerous places, whether it's here or overseas, whatever they happen to be doing. They do training with helicopters there. They rappel out of the helicopters. They do all kinds of things, and they still do some firing. I used to live, for 20 years, I lived just about 2 or 3 miles away from Gruber as the crow flies, and we would hear night maneuvers all the time, and it was just nonstop. And occasionally we would have these big Black Hawk helicopters that would fly over and just rattle the windows. You know, they are very, very active. So that's something just to know that, you know, if you go in on the Bragg side, there is Homeland Security there. And in fact, when we were filming for OCO TV, we sort of asked them if it was okay if we just kind of had a drone that flew up over, just sort of over into their area, and the answer was absolutely not. So even though they allow some hunting over there certain times of the year, they were not going to let us fly a drone into that place. So very, kind of very mysterious, I think, in some ways. And there are areas that are still off limits, even on the Camp Gruber side. So what I want to talk about next is how I was able to get a lot of this information. And there was a lady who grew up out there. Her name was Betty Sanders. She was part of the Sanders family. She became Betty Sanders Spencer. And I noticed that she had a website that she had made where she was sharing old photos from Camp Gruber, from where her family lived. And then she had taken it upon herself in the 1980s to go out there and go take pictures. She did this all up through 80s and 90s, and she went through, she talked to elder people in her family and elders from other families, and she learned where each of these places were. And they tally right up with the allotments when you are looking and seeing where people's allotments were and where those names are. It's very interesting. So you can kind of follow her. She has what she calls a virtual tour. And I reached out to Betty and asked her, if she'd mind sharing some things with me, mind talking to me about it a little bit. She was incredibly gracious. I think she was happy that somebody else wanted to know about what was going on out there. And she was, very, very kind, and she continued to build this website. If you want to go look at it, it's still there. I'm going to warn you that it is an old tripod, Angel Fire, wonky website, and when I go to it on my iPad, a lot of times I get error messages or things that, are kind of really sketchy stuff, so be careful. But if you can get in there, it has a wealth of information. You'll learn all about all of these families. Maybe some of you will see some things about your own families. And you can just, kind of hear the things that she had discovered. And she found all kinds of things. She found where the Yellowhammer School was. And for that, she found a cistern. She found an old well pump. The pump part was gone, but you could see where it was, and that led into a horse trough where the horses had been watered out there. And so other places she found where it looked like, the cemeteries had been, and there were, where kind of depressions where graves had been scooped out. She found occasionally like a little piece of maybe spatterware, or maybe a piece of somebody's part of their wagon or wagon wheels, or just all kinds of things. And so she'd find a little bit here and there. There was one cemetery that she found after she had to go back out a couple of times trying to find this place, but she finally, with a cousin's help, was able to locate it because of a hinge that still existed that was nailed to a tree. So, if there's a will, there's a way, but Betty definitely had it. And I'm sorry to say that we lost Betty back in 2022, but she really did us all a favor by preserving this history. Because I'm certainly not going to say that I learned all of this and found all of this myself. I went through and dug and dug, and anything that people were kind enough to share, newspaper articles, Dawes allotment stuff, anything that I could find that would help sort of tell this story, and then also just going out and getting pictures. These are some allotment maps. Oh, there we go. That are showing up and kind of showing you where people were, that, this is getting to the east of Braggs, between Braggs and Fort Gibson. And then we've got some other areas that are out here. This is kind of in the heart of where this area is that we're talking about. And you can just see tons of names and people's allotments that are up there. You know, if you want to know how to find some of these, I can help you with that. Come see me. But I think this tells the story better than almost anything could about these are families, these are people living in this area, and you know what this represented for all those years before Camp Gruber came along. One thing we didn't talk about was there was a POW camp at Camp Gruber. Did you know that? It was about a half a mile away from the main camp. And the interesting thing was it only housed German prisoners. There was nobody else that was there. It was set up to actually accommodate up to 6,000 prisoners. That's huge. I'm not sure that it ever quite reached full capacity, but it got close. And the interesting thing was the prisoners there were actually treated pretty well. Some of them gained weight. They said they were fed very well. They also got care packages from overseas, from home. But you know, they were treated well. They were sometimes hired out for farming, and that was something that the military could do at the time. And so they were sometimes taken to a nearby rock quarry where they quarried for stones that were used there on the base. They, at one point, had harvested 4,000 acres of spinach. They harvested untold amounts of cotton. So they were actually used quite a bit. And so there's this one gentleman who left a scrapbook. And this is one of his pages. He was a pretty good little artist, and he kind of covers what's going on with this. And as you can see, he's saying, Oklahoma is hot. And so he's trying to show himself sleeping under the barracks because it was so hot he couldn't even go inside their tents to sleep. And he wrote it in English. So yeah, that's kind of impressive too. Now, not all of his pages were written in English. There were quite a few that I had to sort of try to work out what they meant.
Did he go back to Germany?
I believe so. And here's another interesting thing. Some of them actually did come back in the 80s. We have interviews out there. There was one gentleman that wrote to, I think he wrote to maybe like the mayor or the governor of the state and asked if it was possible for him to come over from Germany. He said, I'm trying to revisit different parts from, you know, different years of my life. And, you know, he didn't exactly say he had fond memories, but they apparently weren't horrible enough that he didn't want to come back. And so some of the interviews that I've seen with them are pretty interesting. There are a few on the Oklahoma Historical Society website that you can see and some other places. And so they're, you know, they were interviewing them and talking about what was it like and you know, how did you feel about it? And just the fact that some of them did want to come back and see, and they said, you know, we don't hold any ill will. I'm sure there were a lot of them that did. But first, you know, some of the folks that were interested enough to come back, it was, you know, just closing out a chapter of their lives, I think. So this is just showing you some of the maneuvers and things that they were doing out here at Gruber. So they would take rafts about 5 times that big and lash 3 or 4 of them together and put boards across them and make them where you could drive a tank across. They would make a bridge out of it. It's crazy. And they did all kinds of field maneuvers, you know, so if you can imagine, this is just so interesting that this is taking place not very far from where we're sitting. And if you happen to be a soldier that was checking into Gruber, they gave you this neat little booklet that told about where you could find things. All this was laid out in a grid with streets that were lettered and numbered. And they would tell you, on such and so corner is where the barber shop is. On such and so corner, there's a post office. So they wanted to make sure, there was a laundry, quite a few laundries actually. This is one of the headstones that's out there at Greenleaf Cemetery now that was removed and brought over. Actually, just about anything that you see out there, if you visit Greenleaf Cemetery and it has a death date that is prior to 1942, it was something that was moved. They were not originally buried there. For instance, there is, how many of you, if I say Mose Miller, how many of you have ever heard of Mose Miller? Okay. Who was Mose Miller? They're debating over it. Okay. Oh, it's a different, all right. Well, Mose Miller was probably the biggest bandito of his time. He was a Cherokee outlaw, and his family lived out in this area. And so he eventually meets his maker. After he's imprisoned, he gets out and he just can't go straight, and he meets his maker and is buried there in one of the cemeteries. There was a Miller cemetery there. And so now when you go to Greenleaf, you'll find the gravesite for Mose Miller. So there are a number of people that you'll see out there, and you can just sort of imagine who they were, where they were. You'll see names like the Silks and the Rain Crows, some of these other families that were old Cookson families. A lot of Cooksons buried there.
Was it Cherokee?
Yes, that one was in Cherokee, and I think it was a Sawney. I think that one was a Sawney. And then there are lots of other stones that are like this. So some of them, you can tell they're very, very old. And that some of them are much clearer to read than others. Okay. There we go, I think. Come on. You gotta love technology. It does not love me, I will tell you. Okay, so we talked about the rock fences that you can see out there, and they do go on for miles. This is what's left of them along some of the roads. Like there's all along Cedar Bluff Road. It's one of the areas that you'll see a ton of these rock fences. And so, that there was a homestead here that went with this. Is a little bit different view of some of the rock fences. And they're starting to really crumble and fall down. They're getting buried by the plants out there, but they're still very prominent when you're driving by. Okay, and that was actually us riding across the bridge for the OCO TV feature. So you can tell that they were doing this with a drone. It was February 1st. It was freezing cold, and they talked us into doing that somehow. Right, yeah, it is a good time to ride out there. So again, this is some of the maneuvers that are being done at Camp Gruber. Yeah, they have an air assault school. They have a little bit of everything. So I think I was a little bit late on what I was thinking. It was 1967 when it actually became, first of all, a National Guard training center. So this is, and I'm sorry these are not quite in order and I'm kind of bouncing back and forth, but when you go to Greenleaf, you're going to see some different little tags like this. These are old metal tags they tried to do this on as many graves as they could. And this is trying to tell you who was put into this grave. So this one was Sophie Silk. And some of the roads, and this is, if you can imagine taking a wagon through this, trying to get, this is one of the old roads out there that houses were on. And you know, it was, I'm trying to imagine traveling in the wintertime or the hot summer and going through some of these areas, or the creek gets way up. Sometimes after a rain, they're not passable. There is Greenleaf Bridge. I really do ride out there a lot. Sorry. I'm going to point out this one. We had some people that came out and we rode, and they wanted to ride down to Cedar Bluff. And the only way to get there is to ride through some deep water to get there. And if anybody's been out there and gone to, you know, it's a great swimming hole. It's a great place, beautiful. The water is this amazing blue-green color from the minerals that are in the water, just beautiful. And so it is, it's quite a ways out there if you ride out to it, and it's pretty hard to get to unless you have a really good four-wheel drive. But it is, there's this little patch, and I took these people through because they wanted to see it, and I think they thought I had lost my mind. Again, this is another time we were out there riding in February. There's a pattern going on here, right? So we came through this, and they were just amazed that we finally came out of this water. Horses and mules were fine, didn't bother them, and we got to Cedar Bluff, and they loved it. Okay, these are some of the artifacts that are left. This is a big cellar that's up there when you very first drive down Burnt Cabin Road, which is the main road through the area. And this is the back side of it. The front side of it actually has these deep steps that just go down in there. I don't know what's down there. I'm not crawling down there to see. But it's very interesting. This is in a really pretty site that sits up on a hill and has a view for days. So it must have been a gorgeous place. Okay, and this is the cellar that we were talking about that's out at White Oak and Cedar Bluff Road. And that you can ride right up to it, drive right up to it. It's still there to this day. And it's another place that you can see all the way through to the other side of it. It must have been a pretty good little cellar for keeping whatever you needed fresh in there. I can just imagine. But there was a two-story house that sat back behind this that was occupied by a couple of different families. Okay, this is the house that stood with that cellar that you just saw. And I'm going to end with that.